Murigi Kamande, who's a constitutional lawyer. And we did look at the petition and what we as Kenyans should expect in the next 14 days to unfold. And of course, that is something that we're going to be keeping our eyes on. But as we want to conclude on the political point, let me start with you, Mr. Kamande, on the issue of governance. The reason why we are where we are today as a country is purely down to governance. And we could look at it at Jubilee and NASA, but this is not a problem that we possibly are starting last 5 years or in the last 10 years. It is something that maybe we could look at from the time of gaining our independence, and possibly, are we getting our democracy strategy right, or are we literally just going round in circles? Your thoughts, Mr. Kamande?
I believe that we're in the right direction. Since the enactment of the Constitution of Kenya 2010, what we have seen is that there's a growth in an expansion in the democratic space. And at the same time, we do realize that we have put in place structures and institutions for purposes of ensuring that there is governance in the country. So therefore, I'll say that the starting point is the Constitution of Kenya 2010. It is a very progressive document. And therefore, if we do ensure that all those institutions that we did establish are functional, and then we also need to move from there, we also need to reform the way we do our politics in this country. I remember, and I will always say this is what President Moi always said, that siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya. So unless now we reform the nature of politics that we do in this country, we'll take a long while before we can reform as a country. And therefore, if we move away from tribal politics, if we move away from, I'll call it tribocrat politics, therefore, until we do that, we still have a long way to go. But I believe that we're in the right direction.
All right, Steve, your thoughts on the direction and looking at how we solve our problems. If we look at our current situation in Kenya, we are having a major political crisis. However, we have a tendency to solve them using other means other than solving the political question.
Gitonga, you framed a very important question. I was just smiling because I was wondering, have we really appreciated or truly appreciated the conceptualization of governance under the Constitution? Because if we did, we'd do things differently and we'd know where the gaps lie. Now, the Constitution, which is our article of faith, has ordained a new technique to governance. That technique rests on 5 pillars. Number 1, dispersal of power horizontally. The presidency that we care deeply about is no longer as powerful as it was, because the presidency, the powers that the presidents have been dispersed effectively across the 3 arms of government. We have a bicameral legislature parliament that is independent, largely independent, and is designed to create critical oversight. We have a judiciary that is robust, independent, and functional, a judiciary that is impervious to external or executive manipulation, the one that can cancel a presidential election. That's huge powers. We have constitutional commissions. So you see, in terms of horizontal dispersal of powers, the powers of the presidents have been significantly reduced. Then number 2, the vertical dispersal of resources. Now, resources is the reason why Kenyans care excessively for the presidency. The Constitution provides for a minimum of 15%, and sometimes you're a bit unfair on this government. I think this government could have as well stuck to the 15%. But if information, if it's verifiable that the government has been dispersing over 40% of national resources, national revenue to the counties, that means that the government is left, the national government, or the presidency particularly, is left with only 60%, much of which is going into payment of salaries. So really, the allure and prestige of being in the executive is significantly reduced. Number 3, we have a robust Bill of Rights, what we call a strengthened Bill of Rights that allows Kenyans to challenge government actions. It's more difficult to govern in post-2010 dispensation than it was before. Remember, in Moi's time, his word was law, and you enjoyed his rights, your rights, the extent that he allowed. But in this post-2010 dispensation, the president has significant challenges in terms of arbitrary actions. Number 4 is the issue of public participation. Even before you make a decision at the presidency, there are some decisions that you must necessarily include the people in it, because our Constitution requires what scholars are calling a consultative, deliberative, and negotiated approach to governance. You don't just sit somewhere in status and make decisions. If you do, people will rush to court, a court that is already independent, and those decisions will be nullified. So I think the fifth issue, which I think is where the problem lies, is that of inclusivity. If you look at the design, the technical design of inclusivity in government, the Constitution talks about inclusion of the marginalized groups, women and persons with disabilities, and also the youth. And these ones at every level, they are to be included. In fact, personally, I'm litigating a case where I'm requiring women to be included in Parliament because Parliament has a deficit of 41 women in the National Assembly because of what is called the two-third gender rule. At the national government level, the president is required to, when he's establishing his cabinet, to put together a cabinet that reflects the face of the country. In his appointments of ambassadors and other key officers, he's supposed to reflect the face of the country. That is the kind of inclusion that the Constitution requires. However, there has been a reframing that has taken us away from the proper conceptualization under the Constitution. This reframing has been done for us by our politicians. Politicians are reframing the issue of inclusion to mean that one of their own, that they must be the people that occupy the presidency. And you know, they're able to ride, since Kenyan's politics is mobilized along ethnic lines, and I'm not afraid to say that Kenyans are excessively ethnic. Because we are excessively ethnic, politicians are able to harness that into political capital and say there will be no inclusion as long as your person is not at the helm. Never mind that whoever is there, his powers and ability to help you are significantly diminished, and he will not necessarily, Uhuru Kenyatta will not necessarily benefit in central Kenya.
And that should not even be the model, yes, anyway.
So there is that issue of misconceptualization of what inclusion is, but also the other issue of framing. You know, Gitonga, there's a reason why in this country, under the Corruption Perception Index, this country is ranked 145 out of 183 countries. It means that, as you said before, sometimes the struggle for leadership or the presidency is actually a struggle for co-option into the club of resource managers. Because if you know, in a corrupt country, if you are in the executive, the opportunity for personal aggrandizement are higher. Barack Obama, when he was leaving the presidency, it was reported that after 8 years, he had only made 1 billion Kenya shillings. 1 billion, half of which had come from book sales. I mean, really, the allure and prestige in the West for ascending into the highest office is actually for service delivery.
All right, and you're bringing another aspect there, but I want to, allow me to pause you a little bit and bring in Kamande and find out from you, Kamande, your thoughts on our issue as a country, given that we have what was once referred to as a very ambitious constitution. However, the responsibility, the prime responsibility of our politicians should be to protect the sanctity of that constitution. Are they protecting it, or are they using that constitution, as it were, against the Kenyan people for their own benefit? Because that could be another angle that possibly we've not looked at when it comes to governance. Mr. Kamande.
I tend to think that we got to a position where everybody now is using and selectively using the Constitution for their own benefit. And therefore, every interpretation of the Constitution is geared towards a certain end. And I'll give you two instances, for example. Right now, we have a presidential petition that is before the Supreme Court. You will find that the petitioners themselves who are or even the respondents who are there, who are politicians, that they will adapt different interpretations to suit their positions at the hearing of that presidential petition. The same case when you have, for example, right now talks of secession, and therefore you hear that there are politicians who now want to talk about the right to self-determination, and their position changes drastically from the position they earlier held when it is MRC that wanted to secede. But right now, because it is another section that wants to secede from the country, the interpretation of the Constitution now is directly opposite from the interpretation they had the previous time. But all in all, as long as we have the Constitution, and I have said this, as long as we have an independent judiciary, a very bold judiciary that is not afraid to make declarations on these issues, we saw with the first presidential petition being nullified in Africa. We've also looked at the decisions that have been coming from the High Court on issues of the Bill of Rights. So I believe that at the end of the day, that the key to our resolve as a country in the issues of human rights and democracy, they are supposed to be in a independent judiciary, if we can always ensure that our judiciary is independent, it has all the resources, therefore, and all these rights that are being litigated before these courts, therefore, certainly with time, we are going to be in line, we are going to be in line with the Constitution. But in any event, these politicians come and go. We should not allow them to dictate how we should interpret the Constitution.
All right, Mr. Kamande, we want to wind up, and maybe your closing comments and advice generally to Kenyans, especially because in another 5 years, if, well, depending on how things go, we're going to be here again electing our leaders. We have a very robust and a very good constitution, according to many. However, the leaders that we put in position are either going to mutilate that constitution or help us gain independence, as it were, as Kenyans, for that constitution. Your closing comments and advice to Kenyans.
My closing remarks are, we save for the president and the other elections where we have by-elections. We already have our elected leaders in place, and our hope would be that they are going in the pursuit of the legislative mandate, that the laws that they are going they are going to pass in Parliament are going to be progressive. But in future, when we elect our leaders, and as Kenyans, what I believe is we need to look ahead. We need to be progressive. We need to have leaders not just for the short term benefit, but for the long time, people whom we know are going to protect all the liberties that we have gained so far.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kamande. Your closing comments, Steve Ogola.
Gitonga, the Constitution presupposes that its transformative framework will be implemented in a political environment that has a matching political culture, that matches the vision of the Constitution. I have seen, with shock and consternation, and I'm terribly embarrassed to say this, that our political divide, both NASA and Jubilee, have chosen to manipulate the Constitution for partisan benefit or advantage. They choose when to respect the law, they choose when to disregard the law, and they expect Kenyans to understand. They seem to operate from a position from a privileged position that they are immune to the legal processes. In fact, in this ongoing litigation, NASA, if you look at the rhetoric coming from NASA, because this is what they have said openly, NASA has said that their posture is that of election in 90 days. And we have continuously asked them, could you please reference where that is coming from? There is an ongoing judicial process. If the Supreme Court were to uphold this election, can we say with certainty that NASA will accept and recognize that decision, or they will continue to delegitimize that court simply because their preferred outcome has not been realized? For Jubilee, we saw also Jubilee rushing through election laws ostensibly to improve the election management, but that was a clever maneuver to try and limit the court's chances of nullifying an election. Therefore, Jubilee participated in 2 elections. And I've asked this question. The 8th August election and the October 26th, NASA wasn't in that election. Is Jubilee genuinely committed to go back to a 3rd election, or they will equally delegitimize this court and say this court has been used by NASA or Nile Kotiawakora? So I think what I require from Kenyans is this. It is not beyond Kenyans, and I'm speaking to NASA and Jubilee, it is not beyond Kenyans to determine a different pathway from what is being given to us by NASA and Jubilee. That pathway is predicated in Article 165, Sub-Article 3. It says that any Kenyan can approach the High Court for interpretation of what the Constitution means in every scenario. And we can begin to mobilize ourselves to bind NASA and Jubilee to that determination by the High Court. That determination will be purely a constitutional determination that does not affect Uhuru's presidency or does not affect Raila's interests. What we care for is that, at least insofar as we live under the Constitution, we must uphold the rule of law. A very crucial but fragile ideal, Gitonga. That is what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Steve Ogola there, who's an advocate of the High Court, for joining us this morning. We also had Murigi Kamande, who's an advocate who is a constitutional lawyer, joining us from our city center studios at INM. It's now 17 minutes after 8. We're going to take a short break, but do stay with us. We've got more stories that are making headlines coming up right here on Morning Express.